Good morning. This is Ron. It is April the 1st, Sunday. Welcome to Story Time. And today is part two of the stimulus and the response. And yesterday we covered part one, which was the stimulus part. And we're going to continue with the stimulus because the chapter is basically divided up into two sections, the stimulus and the response. And so basically what it is, Ayn Rand is reviewing a book written by B.F. Skinner. And it has to do with stimulus and response. Let's see. It's called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. So far she's been reviewing it and critiquing the book. And so this is part two of chapter 13, the stimulus and the response. The only social difference between positive and negative reinforcers is the fact that the latter provoke counterattack or rebellion, and the former do not. Both are means of controlling man's behavior. Productive labor, for example, was once the result of punishment. The slave worked to avoid the consequences of not working. Wages exemplify a different principle. A person is paid when he behaves in a given way so that he will continue to behave that way. And from this bit of package dealing, context dropping, and definition by non essentials, Mr. Skinner slides to the assertion that slave driving and wage paying are both techniques of control. Then to the gigantic equivocation which underlies most of the others in his book, that every human relationship, every instance of men dealing with one another, is a form of control. You are controlled by the grocer across the street because if he were not there, you would shop elsewhere. You are controlled by the person who praises you. Praise is a positive reinforcer. And by the person who blames you. Blame is an aversive reinforcer, etc., etc., etc. Here Mr. Skinner revives the ancient saw to the effect that volition is an illusion because one is not free if one has reasons for one's actions, and that true volition would consist in acting on whim. A causeless, unaccountable, inexplicable whim exercised in a vacuum free of any contact with reality. From this, Mr. Skinner's next step is easy. Political freedom, he declares, necessitates the use of aversive reinforcers, i.e., punishment for evil behavior. Since you are not free anyway, but you controlled by everyone at all times, why not let specialists control you in a scientific way and design for you a world consisting of nothing but positive reinforcers? What kind of world would that be? Here, Mr. Skinner seems to make a Freudian slip. He is surprisingly explicit. It should be possible to design a world in which behavior likely to be punished seldom or never occurs. We try to design such a world for those who cannot solve the problem of punishment for themselves, such as babies, retardates, or psychotics. And if it could be done for everyone, much time and energy would be saved. There is no reason, he declares, why progress toward a world in which people may be automatically good should be impeded. Page 67. No reason at all, provided you are willing to view yourself as a baby, a retardate, or a psychotic. Dignity is Mr. Skinner's odd choice of a designation for what is normally called moral worth, and he disposes of it by asserting that it consists in gaining the admiration of other people through a peculiar jumble of examples which includes unrequited love, heroic deeds, and scientific, i.e., intellectual achievements. Mr. Skinner labors to convince us that, quote, we are likely to admire behavior more as we understand it less, unquote. And, quote, the behavior we admire is the behavior we cannot yet explain, unquote. It is mere vanity, he asserts, that makes our heroes cling to dignity and resist scientific analysis, because once their achievements are explained, they will deserve no greater admiration and no greater credit than anyone else. This last is the core, essence, and purpose of his jumbled argument. The rest of the verbiage is merely haphazard cover. There is a kind of veiled subterranean intensity in Mr. Skinner's tired prose whenever he stresses the point that men should be given no credit for their virtues or their achievements. The behavior of a creative genius, my expression, not Mr. Skinner's, is determined by contingencies of reinforcement, just like the behavior of a criminal, and neither of them can help it, and neither should be admired or blamed, unless unlike other modern determinists, Mr. Skinner is not concerned primarily with the elimination of blame, but with the elimination of credit. This sort of concern is almost self explanatory, but I did find it surprising that Mr. Skinner includes achievement among the roots of moral worth, of dignity. He and I are probably the only two theoreticians who understand, from opposite moral poles, how much depends on this issue. In reason, one would expect that so thoroughly a determinist as Mr. Skinner would not deal with questions of morality, but in abolition of reason, but his abolition of reason frees him from concern with contradictions. Beyond freedom and dignity is a normative tract, prescribing the actions men ought to take, even though they have no volition, that the motives and beliefs they ought to adapt, even though there are no such things. From the causal observation that ethos and mores refer to the customary practices of a group, Mr. Skinner slides to the assertion that morality is exclusively social, that moral principles are inculcated through socially designed contingencies of reinforcement, under which a person is induced to behave for the good of others. Then to the notion smuggled in as an undiscussed absolute that morality is behavior for the good of others, and then to the following remarkable passage. The value or validity of the reinforcers used by other people and by organized agencies may be questioned. Why should I seek the admiration or avoid the censure of my fellow men? What can my government, or any government, really do to me? Can a church actually determine whether I am to be eternally damned or blessed? What is so wonderful about money? Do I need all these things it buys? Why should I study the things set forth in a college catalog? In short, why should I behave for the good of others? Yes, read that quotation over again. I had to, before I realized what Mr. Skinner means. He means that the asking of such questions is a violation of the good of others because it challenges socially inculcated principles of behavior, so that even the pursuit of money or of a college education represents not one's own good, but the good of others. And wider, all principles of long range action, moral or practical, represent the good of others because all principles are a social product. Man, he asserts, is aware of nothing but the immediate moment. He has no capacity to form abstractions, to act by intention, to project the future. Behavior is shaped and maintained by its consequences, and behavior cannot really be affected by anything which follows it, but if a consequence is immediate, it may overlap the behavior. Evolution, he asserts, did the rest. The process of operant conditioning presumably evolved when those organisms which were more sensitively affected by the consequences of their behavior were better able to adjust to the environment and survive. What is this sensitivity, and through what organ or faculty does it operate? No answer. Claiming that man's first discoveries, such as uh, banking a fire, were purely accidental. Mr. Skinner concludes that other men learned somehow to imitate those lucky practices. One advantage of being a social animal is that one need not discover practices for oneself. As to the time range of man's awareness, Mr. Skinner asserts, quote, probably no one plants in the spring simply because he then harvests in the fall. Planting would not be adaptive or reasonable if there were no connection with the harvest. But one plants in the spring because of more immediate contingencies, most of them arranged by the social environment. How is this done by a social environment consisting of men who are unable to think long range? No answer. The phenomenon of language is a problem to a mystic of muscle. Mr. Skinner gets around it semantically by calling it verbal behavior. Verbal behavior presumably arose under contingencies involving practical social interactions. How? No answer. Verbal behavior is a means of controlling men because words somehow become associated with physical reinforcers. To be exact, one cannot use the word words in Mr. Skinner's context. It is sounds or marks on a paper that acquire an associational link with the omnipotent reinforcers and stick inside a man's skin, forming a repertoire of verbal behavior. This would require an incredible feat of memorizing, but Mr. Skinner denies the existence of a memory. He calls it storage and declares evolutionary and environmental histories change an organism, but they are not stored within it. His view of the nature of language, therefore, is as simple as the views of black magic practitioners. Verbal incantations have mystic power to effect physical changes in a living organism. Quote, the verbal community, i.e., society, unquote, Mr. Skinner asserts, is the source and cause of man's self awareness and introspection. How? This time an answer is given. Quote, it, the verbal community, asks such questions as, what did you do yesterday? What are you doing now? What will you do tomorrow? Why do you do that? Do you really want to do that? How do you feel about that? The answers help people to adjust to each other effectively, and it is because such questions are asked that a person responds to himself and his behavior in the special way called knowing or being aware. Without the help of verbal community, all behavior would be unconscious. Consciousness is a social product. Page 192, emphasis added, unquote. But how did such questions occur to men who were incapable of discovering introspection? No answer. And that's the end of part 2, chapter 13 of the stimulus and the response. That was an issue from yesterday that I was going to get to, was the deterministic aspects or qualities of Mr. Skinner's book and the way it was being described by Ayn Rand. But she went ahead and got into it herself. And determinism is one of the main philosophical features of the left, and helps you to understand, by understanding determinism and what it is, a lot of the times what is going on in our world and where the left is coming from. Every time that the left wants to have the government involved in forcing people to do or stop doing things, usually stopping doing things, it is from a perspective of determinism. Smoking is the classic example. The society wants us to quit smoking, and determinists say we smoke not because we choose to, out of our own volition and out of our own free will, because as far as they're concerned, well, that would just be insane, but we smoke because we're forced to by conditioning by the advertisements of and various other inducements by tobacco companies. So if we can create laws and rules that prevent the tobacco companies from going ahead and providing those inducements, those things that will force us to smoke, then we will quit smoking. And they also provide other ways to force us not to smoke, such as banning smoking in various places and locations. And I suppose at some point they're going to want to ban smoking on private property. Excuse me. So, but that's the determinism. It's false, but that's what you need to know and understand when you hear about, for instance, the bicycle. The latest thing in LA is creating bicycle lanes, cutting, doing what they call road diets, where if you have a road that has 2 lanes in each direction, cutting it down to one direction, one road in each direction, and creating a bicycle lane out of the other automobile lane. And the idea is behind this is deterministic. The determinists say the only reason that we are driving in cars is because we have a car culture that is created by the automobile companies, the gasoline people, and the oil companies. They are all getting together and conspiring to create a, quote, automobile culture, which forces people to get into automobiles rather than getting out and walking, bicycling, etc. And so the determinists decide that the government has the power and the right to go ahead and create counter pressure, counter force to get people out of their cars, to create a different type of culture, in this particular case, a bicycle culture, and get people out of their cars and on to bicycles. But the whole thing is BS. We have free will. We know that by the evidence of our senses, and we choose to drive automobiles because it's the best source of transportation around. Bicycles went back way before automobiles were on the scene. When automobiles came along, people quit riding bikes as much to travel in automobiles because it's more efficient. You can get more done faster in an automobile than you can on a bicycle, and that's just obvious. Smoking, we do the same thing. We smoke for sometimes because you want to lose weight, because you want to look cool with your friends, that kind of thing. But we choose to do those things. We can choose to do them. We can also choose to quit. And that's one of the areas where that we have free will, is that if we didn't have free will, nobody would be able to quit smoking. And there would be nobody that would say, you know what, I'm giving up my car and I'm going to start walking or taking public transportation or riding a bicycle to work. People wouldn't be able to choose other things. But the very fact that they are able to do that is a testimony to the fact that we do indeed have free will. So tomorrow is going to be a Storytime Extra, and on Tuesday I will resume with Philosophy Who Needs It with part 3 of Chapter 13, The Stimulus and the Response. Until then, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.